Welcome to Save As Ability, a podcast to educate and inform you about disability employment issues. My name is David Darkangelo, and I'm your disability policy expert.
Welcome back for another episode of Save As Ability. Great to have you here, and thanks for helping us continue to grow our channel. If you could like, subscribe, comment, share, it does help us grow. And we got a great episode today. This came from somebody I was in communication with. Somebody had emailed me. It's easy to get in touch with us, saveasability.com or YouTube, or, you can find us. We're easy to find. And they said, I've got a son with an intellectual disability, and we value what you talked about in an episode. He ended up getting a job. So obviously I was pleased about that. And I said, look, can I use that in a future episode? They said, absolutely. So today we're talking about intellectual disability and neurodiversity at work, okay? And we're going to talk a little bit like how we define it, and, because there's some questions about what's a developmental disability, what's an intellectual disability. So we'll get right into it. Now, personally, this matters to me. Why? Because loyal viewers of the show know that we have our person here, Isabella, whose picture I'm holding up right now. My daughter, who has an intellectual disability and a developmental disability. She's on the autism spectrum. But yet she's here trying to work. We're trying to train her to be in a competitive, integrated work environment one day, hopefully. But there's stages to that, right? So I guess my point to start out is that there's a large spectrum here of people with intellectual disabilities. And intellectual disabilities, if you look at it in like a larger ecosystem, would fall under the cognitive disabilities prevalence type if we were looking at like data points like the American Community Survey, for example. So within people with cognitive disabilities, you have then that sub-cohort, I guess you might call it, of intellectual disabilities. And, just to give you an understanding of the scale, we're talking about 1% of the total population of the United States is, so this is a large amount of people. This is, somewhere between 6 and 7 million Americans. And again, really going by the American Community Survey definition, we're talking about significant limitations in intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior. And generally they're diagnosed, or people with intellectual disabilities know it before the age 22. That's like a little bit of a manner with which the programs are classified to be able to deliver programs and services to people with disabilities who have intellectual disabilities. So again, the American Community Survey indicates that there's total about 18 million Americans with a cognitive disability. And of that, you've got this subset, which is somewhere between, 3.5, 4.5 million working age adults who would have an intellectual disability. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here in terms of the neurodiversity at work. The bottom line is that there's a great workforce pool here. There's a lot of talent and really some very high level and sophisticated individuals with intellectual disabilities already in the workforce, or unfortunately on the sidelines, that we first want to get into the labor force and then get them employed, right? So this is a big untapped talent source for companies. So, we want to make sure that the workforce gap shrinks as much as we can. We have some data here. The data point is that in 2024, the employment rate for Americans with any disability, we've talked about this, is somewhere around 22% compared with 65% of those without disabilities. So that's a huge gap. There's like a 40-something point gap there. And unfortunately, that remains the same. So people with intellectual disabilities is somewhat along the same lines in terms of percentages. And it shows that adults with intellectual disabilities, around 44% of them are in the labor force, or people who are, either employed or actively looking for work. All right. So about a third of those are working, that we just indicated. As I was saying, somewhere around 34% of working age adults with an intellectual disability hold a job, which is great. But unfortunately, that's still one of the lowest unemployment rates of any disability group. So unemployment is really too high. It's stubbornly high for adults with intellectual disabilities. Their unemployment rate is about 21%. So that's more than double the national average, which is, challenging. So one of the things we've recognized is that people with intellectual disabilities, more than other groups of people with disabilities, have a difficult time getting that first job and getting that work experience, with only 28% of working age adults with an intellectual disability ever having held a job. That's challenging. So there's a barrier there that we've got to figure out how to get over for the cognitive disabilities prevalence type, but then specifically for people with intellectual disabilities. And we've talked about some of the reasons that we're going to get into, but there's other demographic features that we know of, like the poverty rate. When I saw this data point, I was like, wait a minute, because I know the data point for people with disabilities, but then to look specifically at people with intellectual disabilities, it's over 1 in 4 are at the federal poverty rate, or twice the federal poverty rate. If you want to even go at a higher percentage, it goes up to like 40-something%. So that's really like a failure of all of these systems. We just talked about Ticket to Work a couple episodes ago. We've talked about vocational rehabilitation. Really, those programs are failing this prevalence type of people with disabilities because they're just not, the data just yields that, unfortunately, the results are just, it's not where it should be. So, all right, let's get back to positivity, because what we like to be here on Save Disability is positive. And I've got some ways to bring barriers down. And it's things like, let's really rethink the interview process when it comes to this prevalence type of people with disabilities. Conventional interviews, rigid schedules, those are not working for this prevalence type. So instead, let's have flexible solutions that include things like structured interviews that allow preparation, advanced preparation, flexible shifts, better transportation that can be put in place here. These are all things that we know can raise the level for all people with disabilities, but this prevalence type in particular, all right? And we know that hiring people with intellectual disabilities, once you can get them in, the results are tremendous. We have data from Walgreens. Walgreens did a study. It's a pretty famous study that found that workers with disabilities, and a large amount of those are people with intellectual disabilities, met or exceeded productivity and safety benchmarks and had a 48% better retention rate than their peer workers in the same place. So, that's a very stunning statistic right there, that once you can get individuals with intellectual disabilities employed, oftentimes they can be your best workers and have a better retention rate. Another data point from another study, employer satisfaction. One survey found that 75% of companies that were surveyed had IDD hires, intellectual disability hires, with a 75% approval rating, with 33% of them saying they exceeded expectations with their jobs on a daily basis. That's tremendous. That's saying that, wait a minute, these are some of your best workers, but we've just seen from the previous data that really the barrier is getting them in. So how can we make sure we're putting forth job descriptions that aren't unintentionally screening out, or processes that are really just not allowing these candidates to get through to employment? So we've got to figure that out. We've got some solutions here, I think, or at least some potential solutions. So, we want to make sure that we're providing access to opportunity to provide independence and self-determination for all people, period, particularly with people with disabilities, and then specifically for this group to be a little bit more proactive, because we recognize that it's hard getting them in, but once we get them in, they can be among your best employees. So there's real data behind this. This is smart economics. If you're a business, there's work opportunity tax credits to be able to do this. We're giving away information here, or call on Archangel Communications. We'll help employers be able to put policies and procedures in place to be able to get these people in for interviews and then hopefully employed because they can be among some of your best employees. So the data's here. This is not a risk. This is a benefit to your business and your bottom line when it's done well. So it's challenging, though. If it was easy, it would have been done by now, but we're here to support you. We're optimistic that things could turn around. So hope you liked this episode. It's David Darkangel, another episode of Save His Ability, and I hope you have a great day.
For more information about disability employment issues, please visit our website, disabilityemploymentsolutions.com. The Save As Ability podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, our YouTube channel at Disability Policy Expert, or wherever you stream your podcasts. Subscribe, stream, rate, and review our shows. Your ratings and reviews help our show reach new audiences. Produced by Pod Pro Entertainment. Save As Ability lives within a network of podcasts located at podproentertainment.com. #TheNewRadio. Again, my name is David Darkangelo, and I'm your disability policy expert. Until next time, thank you. I hope you have a great day.